Hello, my name is Dan Hill. I'm the Director of Strategic Design at Vinnova, the Swedish government's innovation agency. Welcome to this session. I'm going to spend a bit of time now unpacking the work that we've been doing with mission-oriented innovation. And in particular, talking about this thing we call the playbook, which has been a document that we've been making over the last 2 to 3 years while we've been testing missions on the ground. So we hope that this will give you some flavor of that work, but also describe what's in the book a little bit. And the book we will release in the next few weeks, so probably the first week of February or thereabouts. So watch this space, but you're going to get a sneak preview of it today. So I'll just click to the next slide. Watch out for that cover, essentially, because that's what's coming soon. So mission-oriented innovation is something that we spoke about a little bit yesterday on Sweden Innovation Days. We took you through some of the theory with some of the folks behind it, as well as the practice on the ground. And I'm going to talk a lot about what we've done here as Vinnova, testing it as an innovation strategy, an innovation policy. The backdrop to this is our sense that we need to change the way that we approach things quite fundamentally. And I draw in particular from this quote by Madeleine Albright, who is the US Secretary of State in a few generations previous of US administration. And she pointed out, I think quite rightly, that we're taking 21st century challenges, most obviously the climate crisis, but also public health crises, social justice crises, but we're evaluating them perhaps with 20th century ideas, and we're using 19th century tools in that sense. And those tools are things like institutions, the institutions that we built the modern world with. Indeed, a bit like the one that I work for, the Swedish government. But it's not, of course, a problem just for Sweden. This is most of the world in the way that we've organized it, comes from the 18th, 19th, 20th century period of development. Now we're reconciling with the externalities of that, as economists would say, the impacts, the outcomes of that kind of method. So we can't use the same tools that we used to create the problem also to fix the problem, it turns out, as we can see. So we have to innovate how we innovate. And that's a slightly awkward phrase, but at Vinnova, our job is to think about innovation as a practice, as a policy as well, on behalf of the government and the other areas of the public sector that we work with, as well as working with industry and research and startups and SMEs, and social innovation groups, all kinds of actors within society, all of whom do innovation. So we need to explore these new methods. Missions comes very much from that agenda. And in particular, missions is interesting because it implies this kind of large-scale, somewhat coordinated, multi-actor, multi-stakeholder approach around a shared target. I'll describe that in more detail. But one thing I want to just say about targets, it's not, let's not get too hung up on the target-setting aspect of missions, which sometimes gets the headlines. We have lots of targets already. For instance, these are all the UN sub-goals. I'm sure you can name them all 176 of them, or however many there are. We're surrounded by targets. Of course, we have national targets. At the Swedish level, we want to be the first fossil-free welfare state. We have targets at regional level. We have targets within industry. We have targets within societal groups and so on. So we're surrounded by targets. The challenge is rather, how do we get to action? How do we turn those goals, all of those nice colors you just saw, into meaningful action on the ground? And that means that we switch, or Vinnova actually, traditionally in our system, we've been seen as a funding agency. And of course, we continue to be a funding agency. That's one of our core jobs, is to fund innovation within Sweden, along with many other actors. It's worth noting, of course, industry spends more money on research than we do, but we contribute to that as well, and we do that in partnership. But also there's other work to do there, not just funding, if you like. So we describe this as innovation funding agency, or indeed an innovation agency, which might be understanding the problem more in the first place, or finding what are the possible tools and solutions before assuming that funding is always the answer, or assuming that a call for funding is the right tool to use. What if we need to reach groups we've never reached before? We must need some different language, some different methods, different approaches. So this is where we turn to missions to explore it. And I also have a hat as a visiting professor at UCL, the University in London, at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, where I work with Mariana Mazzucato and her team. And Mariana's work in particular, actually since about 2013, has been leading the agenda around missions as a way to approach this. She often reaches for a couple of metaphors there. One is the moon landing. And of course, this is one that gets all of the headlines. Indeed, Mariana's written books like Moonshot Economy and so on. And with the moon landing, you saw a clear direction set, a very clear goal set, actually, a target date set almost, like within the end of the decade, and then a huge mobilization across industry and society, something like 20% of American industry involved in the space race at that point, ultimately. And not just things like NASA and obviously jet propulsion, but also computing, also the fabric the astronauts wore on their spacesuits, the food that they ate. Marianne is also often quick to point out that a financial innovation was required, different spreadsheets. There's no way that the moon landing would stack up under traditional cost-benefit analysis. So they had to find new ways of thinking about that as well. But then the other side of this that Mariana and I both also talk about is this book by Richard Nelson, The Moon and the Ghetto, which was written in the late 70s, early 80s, so kind of synonymous, or rather at the same time as the moon landing and the Apollo program. And there, of course, we see that actually things on the ground are far more complex than in space. And in fact, you could argue, I suppose, that getting to the moon was relatively easy. I don't mean to downplay that in any way, but it was at least a technical challenge, an engineering challenge. You could set an arena for it and then focus things on it without worrying too much about, do we need to ask Americans to change the way that they live their lives, right? There was something that could be done outside of that conversation. We know that's not the same as today's questions of social justice or climate crisis. And Nelson pointed this out at the time. He talked about, albeit in the language of the late 70s, the ghetto. So forgive that language, but it's a very good book I recommend people to read because he points out that's far bigger challenge than getting to the moon. It's just much tougher. And you can see that the US has never really solved that problem. And if anything, perhaps it's got even worse. So it's very problematic to try and use that kind of tool of the moon landing for something like the ghetto. They're not the same kind of challenge. You can share certain things, and that's what we wanted to look at. What could we learn from both of these and meld them together? And here we're drawing a little bit from a tradition within Sweden, actually, of something akin to missions, but well before missions was talked about. The Million program, which was the Million program in English, was a program of house building running from 1965 to 1974, I seem to remember. And it was to build 1 million affordable dwellings over that time frame. Extraordinary achievement, actually, for a country of about 7 or 8 million people, as Sweden was at the time. And the Million program, as with many of those modernist housing projects, of course, had shining examples, which are amazing buildings, and also terrible examples, which are less than amazing buildings. So we learned a lot from that. We wouldn't do it exactly the same way again. But it's an extraordinary thing in itself. It's just worth noting that New Zealand gave up on a program recently, like 2 years ago, to try and build 100,000 houses in the same kind of time frame. And New Zealand's about 6 million people, or thereabouts, 5 million perhaps. So it's sort of roughly the same size that Sweden was at the time, and couldn't do it. So somehow we've gone backwards. They said it was impossible to build 100,000. Sweden managed to build 1 million in the mid-60s through to the mid-70s. Very different times, very different context, but it shows that kind of clear sense of purpose, collective endeavor in that direction. And the other image there is from, I think, an early Volvo promo image, but for Vision Zero, or Nollvision in Swedish, or something like that in Swedish, which is about 0 deaths and major accidents from road traffic. So this is an amazing program, again, running actually from the Swedish transport agency, Trafikverket, who decided that we shouldn't do this cost-benefit analysis and assume that people have to die in traffic accidents. That's actually ethically not the right approach. It should be that no one dies. How can you possibly say that one person is acceptable or 10? This is very obviously interesting thinking right now, where we have the same kind of calculus running around a pandemic. But still, Nollvision has over the years, or Vision Zero, has transformed the accident rates in cities and places across Sweden and many other places where it's emerged. So these are good examples, right? They've also spread internationally. Certainly Vision Zero is running all over the world. In fact, Oslo had 0 traffic deaths from pedestrians or drivers in 2018, I believe. So Helsinki, something similar. So they're actually kind of almost achieving it now. which is really interesting. It does begin to also tell us that these are both, again, still a little bit though, engineering-led approaches. With Vision Zero, it was road traffic safety and seatbelts and things. But another way of getting to zero is to reduce the amount of traffic on the cars, on the roads in the first place, right? But that wasn't really part of the agenda. But if I'm a designer, I'm looking to see all of the tools I can use. Can we reduce the traffic and make it safer? We could achieve zero. We've never achieved zero in Sweden, for what it's worth. So with missions, we have this idea, you have this grand challenge, something like 0 deaths from traffic accidents. And then you have a mission, and a mission might be, okay, we need to make our roads safer. Another mission might be we need to make driving skills better, or seatbelts or whatever. And then you have a set of sectors coming together, let's say automobile, urban planning, buildings, education, all of the things you would need, multidisciplinary approach. And then underneath that, this is the diagram on the left there, a set of projects to make those things happen, tests, these are innovation projects then. So at Vinnova, we take that diagram, which comes straight from Mariana Mazzucato, and we say, well, let's turn that into a process, because we want to say this is a participative endeavor. It's not up for me and the government to set a mission or a challenge. It would be not the best way of getting something done now. Again, this is very different to the Apollo program in this sense. We want to say, well, when we're talking about societal change, they need to be on board. They need to be in the conversation. They need to feel like it's their world around them. They need to also be setting the mission and the challenge with us. So we turn that through on its side there. You see I've just sort of rotated the diagram into top to bottom to left to right, implying a kind of process. So it moves through there from setting the agenda, we call this the angle stage, finding the angles on the problem here. And then we collectively set missions together. I'll come into that in a minute. And then we test things with prototypes, and then we build them out at demonstrators. So we have this is a design process diagram that people like me love, no one else does. This is really what that means in practice, though. So this is workshop after workshop, meeting after meeting, discussion after discussion. In 2019, we ran we got through about 500 organizations through these workshops and workshops and workshops and meetings and discussions, walking and talking and moving around the city and so on. We also did these kind of observation works where we got people outside of their offices, walking around, looking at the world around them, saying, why is this street so empty? Why is it so bare? Look at all that space. Couldn't you have greenery here? Couldn't there be something else here? Why is that? It's because of regulations, because of planning law, all kinds of reasons why. But we need to surface who's making the decisions about those and why, and what kind of world did that regulation speak to, and then what kind of world are we moving into next? So through all of those sessions, we made them as diverse as possible, multidisciplinary groups working together. We get these big, messy bits of paper. We call these systems canvases. They're these kind of massively complex drawings that have come through multiple hands, multiple people working together. It's very hard to do this when we switched actually into working from home mode, but we carried on using digital tools, using the same kind of methods here. And so repeatedly, we saw some patterns emerging. And those patterns we organized on a kind of a push and a pull diagram. If I zoom into this a bit, you'll see we picked two areas to begin with, mobility and food. And mobility is, how we move around, obviously, or not. And food is all of food. And within that, we saw some supply side stuff, if you like. So things to do with agriculture and regulation of that. And then demand side stuff. So how do people eat? What's their diet? What do they like? What's their daily food intake? Things like this. And then we could see these patterns down the middle, so we could look at things like, school food, I'll talk about in detail, new types of food, algae, lab-grown meat, new types of beans and so on, healthy, resilient farming, and the life of farmers. What does that look like in the future? Traceable produce, how do we know where food is coming from and where it's going and what happens afterwards? Same for mobility, we saw the same patterns. And then each of those, we use this kind of reframing exercise. So we say, so what if school food was approached as if it was a problem of learning and health and sustainability? So not food, just nutrition we need to put into kids, otherwise they won't turn up to school or they'll fall asleep in the afternoon. But actually, what if food could be part of the curriculum? What if it enabled kids to understand where food comes from? What if it was about sustainable agriculture, things like this? This is, again, I'm a designer, so this is what we call reframing or a framing technique. Take an existing thing and reframe it as something else. What if we could do this with it? And then what do we unlock as a result? Well, maybe we unlock a very different approach to some core problems that we have, for instance. This is a bunch of awkward graphs, which we'll talk about a lot this afternoon, I think, of health costs going up. And most of these are actually pre-pandemic healthcare costs. So this is kind of costs going up for men and women over time. It's health and social care expenses going up. It's within Stockholm region and other things. But you see on the right-hand side there, the percent of healthcare budget dedicated to preventative care is around 3%. So most of our budget is being spent, if I put it crudely, of course it's not this crude, but on the hospital end of the problem, or the drugs or the pharmacy end of the problem. Whereas what we see is those costs are going up because of chronic diseases, 80% of them. And 80% of those chronic diseases are to do with lifestyle and living conditions. So lifestyle and living conditions, that comes back to things like food and mobility. That isn't actually a health sector problem. That's a question of planning, of the way we build cities, the way we move around, the transport industry, the food sector. That's where health problems are created, it turns out. That's where the big cost is. So then we're looking within all of these patterns that we saw, how can we find these things like a school or a street that are around us already, that are currently being run for one reason. And in this diagram on the left there, you see there's an input going in, which has got traffic department written on it. So it's being run by the traffic department because the output then is traffic. I mean, the clue is in the name. If you put the traffic department in charge of the street, you're going to get traffic, more or less of it. If you put gardeners in charge of the street, you'd get gardens, right? So it depends who you put in or what inputs you look to or who you let control the thing. But the street could do many things. If you go to a nice street in let's say an old Italian town on holiday, chances are that street's going to be full of life, full of people running around or sitting down, or old men playing chess, or kids running around a fountain, or Prosecco or whatever, all of the cliches. But that's why we go there on holiday, because they're really beautiful spaces. But that's what streets are. Streets have always been places of exchange and conviviality. They're not spaces for traffic, actually. They've become spaces for traffic only in the last 2 generations or so. And that isn't actually that long, as we can see over the span of how long some of our streets have existed for, including in Swedish cities. Some of our streets in Sweden would be 500, 600 years old. But it's only again in the last couple of generations that you see this traffic dominance. So what we're trying to do is unfurl all of the possible things you could pull out of a street: biodiversity, community life, health, all of these things. They can all be produced by the street or diminished by the street. We want to increase the good things and obviously reduce the bad things. Simplistically again. So coming out of this, we found through this process of all of these workshops, all of this distilling, and lots of conversations, again, multi-stakeholder groups, public, private, third sector, working together, multiple layers of government, big industry, small startups. We found these 4 different angles each side. Each of these become kind of mission possibilities around mobility and around food. Now, I won't go into them in detail now. I'll just pick a couple to get into. So looking at then streets, we then took these then into further workshops. So these then were zooming in now into the ground. And here you can see 4 people working together, or 5 actually, you see the hands in the bottom right, on a shared picture of the street. And they're coming up with, what does this street need to do? What could it be in the near future? And then there we see people from startups, from municipal transport agencies, interaction designers at tech companies, health researcher from Karolinska Institute, and so on. And these are the kind of composite drawings which came out of those sessions. So lots of tons of lovely ideas, everything from new types of leasing arrangement to new types of business to completely super green streets to active transport to the fore, so walking and cycling and e-bikes, but also like autonomous shuttles dropping e-commerce off. All kinds of things are in these pictures, right? But you also get a flavor of them. Even looking at them, if you squint your eyes, super green, super convivial, really kind of full of life, actually. So then we flip this inside out, because those workshops we call the system in the room workshops, where we try and get as many different stakeholders from the system as possible. Again, as diverse a group as we can. But still, it's still a bunch of stakeholders, with all due respect. I'm one of those. Working together in a room. Now we need to flip it inside out and get out into reality. So this is when the street mission becomes actually really participative. Before it was kind of stakeholders engaged. Now it starts moving towards real people. I feel I can put it like that. Again, I'm a stakeholder too, right? But I'm also a real person, I think. So here the mission becomes every street in Sweden should be healthy, sustainable, and full of life by 2030. So we put a notional target date on it, but it's almost possible to imagine. And it's also near enough to make it tricky. We're not going to set 2050 for something like this. That's way too late for almost anything here. So healthy, good question. What do we mean by that? I'll come into that later. But we know what a healthier movement looks like in that sense. So moving in this direction, we're taking steps towards healthier streets all the time, more sustainable and full of life. But then how do we get this happening? So here we're going to get down to the ground. And the first thing we did was working with Stockholm Stad, the municipality in Stockholm, was find 4 streets in and around Stockholm. They all had schools on them, actually, and that meant we could make the school kids the lead designers of this work. So the school kids themselves become the architects, the urban designers here. They're the primary users of these streets. These are quite small streets with schools on them, so they're the dominant activity. If a street next to it had an old person's home on it, then it would be old people in the picture doing these drawings. If it was student housing, it would be students, right? But here it was these kind of school kids, so it becomes 6- and 7-year-olds. And they're amazing designers, by the way. We give them a kit of parts. Again, imagine something a bit like IKEA or Lego or Minecraft, which of course kids are super used to. But it's basically a variation on the tools that real planners use. And we've done this at multiple levels, by the way. This is working with the former Swedish Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven, and the current Health Minister, Lina Hallengren, before the pandemic, obviously. And then we're working in a similar way here. But kids tend to have a very intuitive way of understanding what's possible to change, what streets could be about. And so you see in their designs for their streets, this is, again, the section where the school sits. So it's kind of their bit of the street, if you like, even though there's other users here as well. And we also talk to them. You see playgrounds, you see greenery, you see swing sets, you see fake palms, because it's Sweden and climate change hasn't kicked in enough to enable real palms yet, but maybe one day. Fake palms for now, cafes, playgrounds, etc., etc. They again get turned into workable versions of those things. So these are done by White Architecture and Spacescape, working with Stockholm Stad, the municipal planners. And you can kind of see here, there's a sand pit down the bottom of the street there. There's a very busy road at the bottom here, by the way. So this isn't like a side street in the middle of nowhere. This is right in the middle of town. Helsingagatan, for those of you that know Stockholm. And there's a cycle lane there, or a cycle hotspot. There's a place for scooters and so on. And then think, how do we make this scalable, though? We don't just want to change this one little bit of middle of Stockholm. So here we come up with this idea of the boardwalk, or a kind of a platform that it can sit on. So I see those wooden blocks on the left-hand side there, and then an application on top of this. This is a bit like how actually phones work. Actually, you have things like the App Store, a baseline there, and the operating system, and then applications on top of that. And everybody's phone has different applications because they're different people. So here we can have different applications on the street. Could be super green, could be lots of bike sharing, could be bike parking, could be scooter parking, it could be a barbecue pit, ping pong, whatever you think, whatever the street thinks, rather. And it's built on this base layer, which is repeatable and extendable and modular and can be used, and actually, importantly, adapted as well. And this is a key thing. It's made out of wood so that it can be changed and adapted over time. Wood's a very powerful material in that sense. It's much better than steel and concrete, even though it's in numerous ways, in almost every way, I would argue. But it's the exact opposite of what municipal transport departments usually use when they build street furniture. Usually they use steel and concrete because you don't have to maintain it. It lasts for 50 years, right? That's a problem, and that's the problem we've got into. We're not caring for the streets, and we're not changing them enough. And actually, we need to be able to come back to this street every couple of years and say, what's changing? Is the culture changing? Do we need to adapt the environment? Did scooters disappear? Did they increase? How many more bikes do we deal with now? How many fewer cars are there? And that means we can build in this sense of change. But also this Swedish timber, by the way, is super sustainable, clearly. It's, if grown well in diverse forests, it's incredibly sustainable. And here you can see it's also being cut using CNC processes to fit to the street directly. It's then put together on site very quickly indeed. And so it can be put together in a couple of hours by a relatively easy process. But we would love to get this to the stage where the citizens themselves can be also joining in this building process. Imagine the school kids putting together the thing that they built, or indeed the residents in that building there. So this is then what comes out of this. And again, these are prototypes, right? So they're not designed to be the finished thing. And as I said, they're designed to change. So don't think this is kind of anything finished. This is the start of something. But here you see the kids playing on it. You see the bikes and the scooters filling up. Of course, as soon as you make bike parking, it fills up in 2 seconds. Just like if you make car parking, it creates cars. So what you make parking for is what you get. We wanted to increase the bike parking here, obviously, and these are sitting in parking spaces. So it's designed to sit in something that we've built all over Sweden at scale. In fact, we have 40,000 kilometers of street like this in Sweden. That's 6 times the size of Paris as an addressable area. It's enormous. And most of that has been now oriented around cars, despite the fact that that isn't what we will need going forward. Or indeed now, actually. So this is on another street in Stockholm, and this is just to give you a sense of the way that it feels and looks. This is just some video running. I'll just talk over the top of it briefly. So here you see bike parking, scooter parking. You can kind of see how it fits into the environment. We said very clearly, this is welcome to the experiment, essentially. Welcome into the experiment in Swedish. And so we wanted to be clear that this is an experiment. This is a prototype. My colleague Kieran Long, the director of Arctes, who we worked with very closely on this, and they led this design work, working with Lundberg Design, a great Swedish design company. Kieran always says, prototypes are always wrong. And that's true. They're wrong on purpose, though. So we kind of get them wrong because we want to find things out. But we need to let citizens know that and let them be part of that. So this is what this is about. This is then in Gothenburg. That was previously in Stockholm and then moved to Gothenburg again, just showing actually also works in the cold. I think it was -2 that day on the left-hand side there. And on the picture on the right-hand side is in Helsingborg, where you can see actually, which is a town in the southwest of Sweden, lighting being introduced, bigger planting and so on. So you see it kind of varying as it moves from place to place. We'd love it to be even more varied. Imagine it being painted in the colors of the local football team, being adapted or hacked in numerous ways, again, as with IKEA or Lego. So let me run a quick film now about what's happening in Helsingborg around this.
So Street Moves is an innovation project. It's a design project where we invite many different stakeholders. We invite people who live in the cities. We invite public and private partners in working together in how we can use the streets in many different ways. And what we see here is kind of a semi-permanent solution where we can rebuild and reimagine how streets could look like without digging into the streets and so without making a really big changes directly on the streets.
We are trying to do something else with the street. This is an old street, I should say, that we will rebuild in 2023. And this is a tryout to see if we can use it on another way.
This is about making. It's not about talking, but more into the action. So next phase will be to try even more developed solutions with charging, with sensors and with many other technologies that we can see will be very interesting for streets.
My name is Karin Ebbinghaus. I'm part of Elon Road and we are what we called Electricity on Road. And we have developed a new kind of charging infrastructure that makes it super easy and convenient to charge your EV both while you're standing still as well as driving. That is the bottleneck for full electrification in the city. And we can see that this project really aligns with our interest to make it easy, convenient and more sustainable to have EVs, but perhaps fewer EVs in a city. So having a car sharing mobility company using our technology is something that is really important to us.
Shared mobility, for example, that is something that is very important when we talk about the sustainable development of cities.
This is a perfect place to try this. It's a small street, but still a lot of heavy cars here, also pedestrians. So it's a lot of people that meet in this street.
I think I'll leave it there, but just to also, I should have announced that you saw people from Arctes, the National Center for Architecture and Design. That was Daniel first, and then Helsingborg Stad, Helsingborg Commune, which is the municipality there, one of the planners. And then, as you heard from Elon Road as well, one of the companies involved around the project. We also have people from Volvo Cars, car sharing. You saw them in the film in the background, Voice Scooter Company, and so on. So there's lots of ways of using a mission to take a focus on a place and a particular intervention point, and then have multiple actors working together around that. So some of the principles behind this as well, you heard a few of them there actually, but get started. And we worked with the artist and musician Brian Eno on this, and I asked him to write some design principles for us, which he did very generously. So thank you to Brian. But one of the key things in the top left there was think like a gardener, not an architect. Design beginnings, not endings. And this is very hard traditionally for a government or a city to do. Usually they have to make a promise, right? It will be this in 3 years. And then this is what we will do, and this is how much it will cost, and this is how much concrete we need, and so on and so on. In this case, actually, we know that this kind of innovation requires a far more sophisticated approach. Let's get started on something and grow it over time. Any of you that know have ever done any gardening or have a garden or live near a park or so on, you might have a plan for the garden, but nature is going to happen to you, right? So biodiversity is complex, and the only way you deal with that is by having a thought in your head, a plan for sure, but then engaging and engaging and engaging. So getting out there and weeding it and cutting it and tending and harvesting and cultivating, all of these lovely words. That's how things grow in reality. That's how buildings happen. That's how society happens. We need to work our innovation system in that way as well. This kind of prototype-led approach is really important. But crucially then, it's not the end result. And this diagram by Utopia architect shows what we call the half step. So this is a street in Helsingborg, Rektorsgatan. And all we're trying to do is take a step forward like this. We're not saying that's the end point, by the way, whatever the end point means for a street, because it's continually evolving. But maybe it needs to evolve into this over time, for sure. It needs to be super green, and we need to dig up the concrete so that trees can put roots down. We know trees require roots, and that's hugely a huge part of their value. That greenery also absorbs stormwater, which we know will be an issue in Swedish cities increasingly. Greenery provides shade, all of those things. But here you see social life, biodiversity. You see a far more kind of fluid street, far fewer heavy traffic vehicles, but lots of micro-mobility instead. The thing is, you can't jump straight to this, even though, as a designer, I know we probably need to move in that direction for sure, something like this and something adaptable. But still, you can't jump there in one go. So going back one step, this half step enables us to get things going, enables us to start the conversation, bring the citizens in as participants. It's their street, after all. The street designs the street, is something we talk about here, and it gets the thing moving. And this is a much easier first step to take because it's maybe temporary. It can evolve. It can clearly evolve over time. It's built to be moved around. Now then, in the end, you can imagine lots of things. Utopia architecture, again, did these lovely drawings, beautiful social, civic spaces. Things like technologies need to be involved, as Daniel said, like from ArcDes, sensors, car sharing, car charging, even all of those things. Scooter parking, but also greenhouses. Again, the sky's the limit. People will figure out interesting things to do with it. We just need to let them understand the street designs the street. It's their street to design. Now, as a result of this participative process, perhaps we're getting quite good results from this so far. So we're getting 73% positive feedback on the whole experiment. So and this is taking parking space away, which is the thing that people like having done to them least, apparently. So this is really, really positive in a sense, and it's partly because they've been part of the process and they understand that these are things that can change and adapt over time to match their needs as they change. That changes the street from something you don't think about, you don't touch, somebody else's problem, into something that becomes more like a shared garden, a shared front yard, a shared playground. And we saw a 400% increase in activity as a result. We also saw a huge amount of interest in this internationally, by the way. This is probably the project which has had the most press in our 20-year history in many respects. So it's very, very interesting that people jumped on this idea of this, what I call the 1-minute city, the city outside your front door, your living environment there. Livsmiljö in Swedish, what's around you and you can interact with, but built and non-built environment. What's also underpinning this is a separate project we're running in parallel, what we call the value model, which is looking at all of the value that this might be able to produce. So what does this do around maintenance? Does it reduce maintenance, actually? If we have less stormwater washing around the streets, you need fewer drains because you have more greenery. The shading from the trees prevents things cracking in high temperatures. You increase health and well-being. As I told you a while ago, there about our healthcare costs going up forever, apparently, till the end of time. That can't be sustainable. this kind of move actually increases people's health and mental well-being very significantly indeed. If I zoom into this, you'll see all of these things are bits of research we already know, as in there are tons of researchers who have made their life's work these things. If you reduce traffic noise, that increases birdsong and birdsong diversity. If you increase birdsong, people's mental health improves. If you increase birdsong, they recover from serious sicknesses quicker, which would be useful right now. All of those things have material value, real costs, or real investment on the end of that. If you reduce parking, retail does better. That's never what shopkeepers think, but that's repeatedly what we've shown, because it turns out people like to shop physically if they want to go shop in a physical shop. So all of this data exists, but it's rarely brought to bear because usually the traffic planning is deciding what's happening here. So around these projects, and sorry for the small words, you don't need to worry about them. Just at the top, you imagine we have these place-based experiments, Gothenburg, Helsingborg, etc. And then we have these green layers underneath are just different bits of the system that are in play here. Skills, data, financing, policy, law, they're transferable across Sweden, actually. So what's on the top is super specific. Helsingborg is completely different to Gothenburg, completely different to Stockholm, totally different to Umeå, where it's heading next, which is up near the Arctic Circle almost. But what is the same parking space law in all of those 4 cities. So that's the same consistent layer. And on the right-hand side, you can see we have different actors aligned along those different layers there. So Transport Sturluson have been part of the project from the start. So multiple projects working towards this kind of North Star, we call it, in the middle. Again, this kind of mission for the streets. So let me show you quickly again now what we're doing with school food. Same kind of approach, slightly different methods on the ground, interestingly. The reason we look at school food is an enormous system in Sweden. Half of all the meals served every day are in the school food or the public food system. So it's something like 2.2 or 2.3 million meals a day going through it. But it tends to be, again, a bit like the street, have been optimized for cost and efficiency. Not bad things in themselves, but not the reason that we eat, actually. So how do we make the school food healthy, sustainable, and tasty has become the mission there, and then for every student in Sweden. So that's the social justice question. Just like every street has to be every student. So then we worked closely with our agency sister, Livsmedelsverket. Livsmedelsverket is the Swedish food agency. And they run part of the policy making here. The food itself in municipalities is going through kind of local cities to schools there and so on. And they commissioned, or Vinnova and Livsmedelsverket worked together to commission Antrop, the service design agency, who did some lovely work doing all of that on-the-ground research, exploring the food system in detail. And so we found these, again, different angles, intervention points. The first thing we started doing was stirring up activity around this. So again, we made this little film talking to kids, talking to school children. Actually, Antrop made this, not me. And this described what's kind of possible. Again, I'll run this briefly. I'll just talk over it as well because it's in Swedish, and my Swedish isn't good and yours may not be either. But what the kids are talking about here is the kind of school that they'd like. And this is an old premise, obviously, in education. Ask the schools, ask the children the kind of school they'd like. And here they're talking about what if we could grow food on the school, in the school grounds, working with the chefs, working with the teachers. We can use tech, we can use very old techniques and so on. So this is stirring up activity for the mission, and it's super important. Then we ran what we call a call for funding, and we found 4 municipalities to work with here who said we want to be prototypes. And each of those 4 prototyping municipalities would test different things. And then some of them would test them all. So looking at the connection between the school meal and learning, for instance. Currently, they're in separate boxes. The curriculum is run by the school agency, and the food is run by the food agency, and it's delivered through the municipality. And Vinnova is usually not in the picture at all there. Here we're trying to understand how do you mix all of these things together to enable innovation in school food. That also is to do with the curriculum. How do people learn about food, learn about sustainability through food? You can teach anything through food. You can teach politics, landscape, colonialism, immigration, technology, science, biology. All of it can be explained through food. So then again, prototype. Get to the test as quickly as possible. In Hofors, they started looking at how do kids learn about food by working with the local science center. In Karlstad, the kids worked with local architects, and again, Antrop, we see Jenny, one of the service designers from Antrop there, working with kids to say, what would you like your school meal environment to be like? As you know, when you go to a restaurant, that's a big part of it. unless it's fast food, right? But if you go to a restaurant, the ambience, the way it looks, the way the staff are, the way the food is served, the music, the environment, the architecture, all of those things add up to whether it's a nice meal or not. And you do the same in your home, I would imagine. So yeah, why do we have school kitchens almost as some kind of industrial process? That doesn't make much sense. So here we let the kids work and say, well, it could be like this, and we'll show you in a moment. Valentuna is very much around testing new types of food, like getting kids to expand the diversity of tastes they might explore, and they did that in very careful and lovely ways. And then in Munkedal, they were looking at, well, again, the similar kind of thing. How do we get kids involved in cooking with the staff and so on in the kitchen to explore how wide their menu choice can be and how local it can be as well, actually. But then we also looked at using the school grounds at the weekend for a food market, a farmer's market, essentially. And here you see hopefully sustainable sausages being cooked in the school's playground at the weekend, which is a big community event. So I'll run a film just talking about the school food mission and the prototypes with some of our project managers, like Alexander you'll hear from, and then our partners like Elin at Livsmedelsverket.
We are facing great challenges when it comes to achieving a healthy and sustainable future. And world leaders, they have agreed to achieve the sustainability goals. But to achieve them, we have to work in many areas at the same time. And one crucial sector to work with is the food system. Food is the single largest contributor to the challenges we face. And 1/3 of all food produced is wasted. Yet, there are 800 million people that face hunger. At the same time, obesity is one of the biggest health risks in the world. In addition, food production of today contributes hugely to biodiversity loss and emits a large proportion of greenhouse gases.
We will need to transform the entire food system. So where do we start? Well, look at food in schools. Schools, they cook, they purchase, they serve a huge amount of food. And the eating habits of entire generations are partly forged at school. So school meals provides an opportunity to transform the system as a whole. We need to bring together key players and work together towards shared, bold, and engaging goals. And we need to work in a way that enables us to learn. We do this with the prototypes.
So we want to start early and to get these younger kids curious about eating new food, perhaps unknown to them. For example, plant-based food.
Yes, the whole build-up is trying to make them excited.
Gott. Kul.
As far as we see today, they are very curious and excited about it, so it's great.
Jag tyckte också det var kul och spännande. Jag läste på ett mjölkpaket en gång och då så att man kunde vara miljöhjälte, så det ville jag bli det.
Through research and broad engagement, we have identified some areas that could have the greatest effects in achieving the goal. We call them levers. They work in a way that a small shift in a lever will impact multiple aspects of the system. The levers in our school food system includes, for example, to involve students and school staff in developing school meals, or ways to shape and design the school meal environment, or a way of hooking school food into the curriculum.
We've started off with a school restaurant that was very pale, ordinary.
Men det var ganska grått, väldigt vanligt. Alla gråa stolar, gråa bord. Det var en vanlig vardag och det var inte så jättekul.
Istället så åker man kanske någon annanstans till McDonald's eller Pekos eller liknande.
And we wanted to make a change and involve the students, and that's been a really big part of this project. They had so many ideas, and ideas that we didn't think of.
Eleverna själva så kommer med förslag i alla årskurser också.
Jag tycker att det är mycket bättre här i matsalen just nu än vad det var förr.
Maten blir typ godare fast det inte är förändring i maten. Så det är väldigt, väldigt fint.
När vi ska göra något sånt här som ska gagna eleverna, så är det viktigast för mig har varit att se till att det har varit ett reellt elevinflytande. Och det känner ju jag att det verkligen har varit här. De är jättestolta, de elever som har medverkat i workshopen som ligger till grund för hur det blev.
We use a mission-oriented innovation approach to align these various aspects in a clear and compelling direction. And our mission is that every child in Sweden eats healthy, sustainable and tasty school food. So the work here from Vallentuna and Karlstad are only 2 out of 10 of the mission's prototypes. Each prototype is designed to target several levers, and since each lever affects multiple parts of the system, this can unlock a kind of ripple effect of interactions on a system level. And given the scale of the school food system, this begins to affect the broader food system behind it.
Nu får man förändring på ett väldigt bra sätt.
Och många fler matgäster har vi haft. Så det känns jätteroligt.
So it's been an exciting progress, and we have still a lot to learn and change, but it happens so fast as well.
Yeah, it sort of happened fast. And yet also there was a kind of a 2-year build-up behind that, as I explained. All of those workshops, all of that collaboration, the careful service design work done by Antrop. But then, as people say, sometimes things to take a very long time and then they happen suddenly. And that's often how system change can begin to happen. You're laying the groundwork, again, like with a garden, if I use that metaphor, you're preparing the soil for quite some time. But then actually you can plant multiple seeds and they can all spring at around the same time. And that's the way we're approaching this, as my colleague Alexander said there, by using levers, the existing levers installed in Swedish society on the ground here, the streets or the school food, we can activate them simultaneously across the country. So we start with a few prototypes to show what's possible, to understand ourselves what's possible. As we heard from the principal there, if you get kids involved, they come up with things you can't possibly think about. Both we saw that with the streets and the school environment there. But we can use those things as system levers because they're behind something like school food, given the scale of the system, is pretty much half of the agriculture in Sweden, much of the logistics. Tons of people involved in food processing, in cooking, and in preparing food, in teaching, and so on and so on. I mean, it's millions of people, actually. And it's the same with streets. Streets are connected to every single bit of the mobility system directly, physically, actually. We don't think of that as one big system, but it is one huge connected system. So what do we learn from this? Let me close with a few kind of learning points. It's not easy, is the first thing I would say. Sometimes I've been told I have a tendency to say, look, we did this, and then we did this, and then this happened, and the dominoes started falling. I would just say, again, incredibly hard work. I think, as I said yesterday, it's hard to turn around an oil tanker and stop it being an oil tanker at the same time. But that's the kind of game that we're in here. So we are actually looking at reversing some things or reframing some things or redirecting. Again, streets not ruled for efficient movement of traffic, but streets as places for conviviality, biodiversity, health, social life, culture, and so on. That's a huge shift, akin to an oil tanker. The same with school food. Food, again, about learning, about health, about sustainability, as well as nutrition and cost. So we only get to this by looking at working with stakeholders and participants. This is hugely collaborative, actually a participative process. And again, that's less policy making as something done in a room and then delivered onto society, and far more an interactive, responsive, ongoing experiment, really, which is what democracy actually is originally. It means looking at how we use that participation to move from angles, the understanding of the architecture of the problem, into action. And moving from stakeholders actually towards people and sectors, which don't really exist in reality, towards places. Places is where they all come together in terms of everyday life, and that's what surrounds us. Shops, schools, playgrounds, swimming pools, these kinds of things. That's where sectors actually happen. So within that, again, we can look at reframing cost to investment. In this funny graph on the left here, you see we spend 7 billion Swedish crowns a year on school food as the public sector, and it's oriented towards, the second diagram, hygiene and cost, efficiency metrics. What if we could use that same investment and produce sustainability, health, and learning? We can do that. It's food. All of that is possible. And then we can talk about this scaling. I talked about the platform strategy. By looking at existing places, how do we test one street and then all the streets in Sweden at the same time? That's a delicate balancing act, but it has that possibility. Beginning to then build these platforms as platforms for asking questions on, so vehicles to explore the future with. A street like this is replete with question marks. So what are they? What are environmental sensors? How do we manage e-commerce drop-off points? How do we plan around biodiversity? How do we engage people in this? And this then comes to the final 2 points, what we call the snowball, which seemed an appropriate metaphor for Sweden half the time. Start small, start something rolling, roll it down the hill and add people to it as you go, add learning to it, add actors to it. And instead of obsessing about point 3, where we finally end up, start with point 1, but get something rolling and make sure it has the DNA, all of those actors on board to grow over time. That changes finally the way we think about our funding and the way we work as an agency and what innovation is. Instead of having this funnel where we take a call for application, we have applicants from 50 different people and we pick one, actually we want to trigger multiple experiments running, more like a portfolio of projects. That's what we see on the right-hand side there. All these projects become potential collaboration points one way or another. So then I will stop, and this is the last slide. So I think this is summarizing it, what missions are about. A clear shared direction, massive collaboration, place-based approach unlocks these systems, these approaches participation, the value embedded in the existing systems, prototyping for understanding how they change and putting tech into social context. The platform strategy enables us to scale things out by this ongoing process again. And the agency, what we end up doing really is the cement between the bricks, just the glue, learning as much as possible and seeing how they all fit together. That's our role here. And then we can begin to understand what is the role of ourselves as an agency, what kind of innovation do we require for Sweden next, and what kind of innovation could we unlock in this mission-oriented approach for the 21st century. All of that and more is in that book. There's a little promo for it there. It'll be released, as I said, in the next couple of weeks, so watch this space. And with that, I will leave you. Thank you very much for watching, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Thank you.